Hey guys, Miss Cote here. We're on to the next and last body system in our cell communication unit, the endocrine system. Just to remind you all, we started our current unit with Chapter 11, which introduced us to the different ways that cells can communicate with each other. One of the ways was long-distance signaling, which is called endocrine signaling. So in this chapter, we'll be focusing on the endocrine system, whose job it is to deliver messages throughout the body using chemical signals called hormones. Hormones will deliver their message to target cells, which have a specific receptor for the hormone. The binding of the hormone and receptor will initiate a signal transduction pathway to elicit some sort of response. We've already looked at the nervous system. If you remember, the nervous system uses neurons that transmit signals, and sometimes these neurons can regulate the release of hormones. So these two systems do have some overlap to them. So let's get started. First, let's quickly review the various ways that cells can communicate with each other. Basically, this is classified by the type of secreting cell and how the signal gets to its target. Up top, we have endocrine signaling. Hormones secreted by endocrine cells travel through the bloodstream to their target cells. Endocrine signaling maintains homeostasis, mediates responses to environmental stimuli, and regulates growth and development, including sexual development and reproduction. The two other methods on this slide are paracrine and autocrine signaling. The signals used in both are called local regulators because they act over short distances and reach their target cells through simple diffusion. The difference between them is their target cells. Paracrine signaling is for nearby cells, while autocrine signaling is for when a cell needs to signal itself. Examples of this type of signaling are blood pressure regulation, reproduction, and the immune system. There are two different types of neuron signaling as well. In Chapter 48, we saw how neurons can transmit signals called neurotransmitters across a synapse to a target cell. This is called synaptic signaling. There are other specialized neurons called neurosecretory cells that secrete signals called neurohormones that go directly into the bloodstream and travel to their target cell. This is an example of the overlap between the endocrine and nervous systems. Another important signaling molecule does not work inside the body. Rather, it works by being released into the external environment to signal other members of the same species. These signals are called pheromones. Pheromones can be used to mark trails leading to food sources, defining territories, warn others of predators in the area, and to attract a potential mate. Molecules that are used in chemical signaling can basically be classified into two types: water-soluble and lipid-soluble, and that applies to hormones as well. And because these two types of molecules have different characteristics, how they get their job done is different too. Water-soluble hormones cannot cross the membrane, so they need to meet their receptor on the surface of the target cell. Depending on the textbook, water-soluble hormones are the protein or peptide or amino acid-based hormones. And it is their structure that prevents them from passing through the membrane, especially the middle hydrophobic part of the membrane. Lipid-soluble hormones are also referred to as the steroid hormones. And since steroids are part of the lipid family, they're hydrophobic and can diffuse right through the membrane to meet their receptor inside the cell. So let's look at an example for each. A classic example of a pathway for a water-soluble hormone would be epinephrine. Since epinephrine is water-soluble, it needs to meet its receptor on the cell's surface. Binding of the hormone to the receptor sets off a signal transduction pathway. In this case, using a G protein coupled receptor and second messengers to get a response, which in this case is a breakdown of glycogen into glucose. For an example of a lipid-soluble pathway, let's look at estrogen. Estrogen, being a steroid, can diffuse right across the plasma membrane and works with the intracellular receptors. Here the receptor is in the cytoplasm, and when the hormone binds, the hormone receptor complex can directly regulate gene expression by going right into the nucleus and acting as a transcription factor. The same hormone can even have different effects, depending on the receptor or the transduction pathway that the cell has. So let's take a look at how this can happen by looking at our old friend epinephrine. In figure A, here we have epinephrine binding to a beta receptor in a liver cell, resulting in the breakdown of glycogen. In figure B, epinephrine binds to another beta receptor in a blood vessel cell that supplies skeletal muscle to relax the vessel and increase blood flow to the muscle. While these two cells have the same receptor, they use different transduction pathways to get the appropriate response. In figure C, epinephrine binds to an alpha receptor in a blood vessel that supplies the intestines. Here, instead of relaxing the vessel, it has the opposite effect and constricts the blood vessels, decreasing blood flow to the intestines, so different receptors will give you different responses. To use an example I've used before in class, if you're in the middle of a fight or flight response, this is what your body's doing. If you just ate a cheeseburger on a camping trip and are being chased by a bear, you obviously want to break down glycogen into glucose to be used in cellular respiration to create ATP to give you energy to run. You also want to increase blood flow to your muscles to bring oxygen to complete cellular respiration to create the ATP for energy to run. However, your body really doesn't care about digesting your cheeseburger at this moment in time, so you decrease the blood flow to your digestive system. Hopefully this all makes sense when looking at the big picture. These hormones are secreted by endocrine cells, which are part of endocrine glands. These can be standalone, like the thyroid, or it can be part of an organ involved in other organ systems, like the stomach. Here's an overview of all the endocrine glands in the body and all of the hormones they make. You're not required anymore to memorize this chart, but I'll explain later why it may be good to have an example of how two opposing hormones maintain homeostasis. Since I don't have to teach you all of the hormones, I just want to give you a general overview of feedback regulation. Here's an example of negative feedback. This is a simple endocrine pathway where a stimulus, in this case low pH in the intestine, probably when stomach contents are moving from the stomach to the intestine, will cause an endocrine cell to secrete a hormone that tells the target cell to release bicarbonate, and bicarbonate will neutralize the acid. Bringing the pH back to normal shuts down the pathway. Negative feedback reduces the initial stimulus, helping to restore the body to its pre-existing state, in this case, intestinal pH. You can also think of it as reversing a change. Here's an example of positive feedback. This is a simple neuroendocrine pathway where a stimulus, in this case an infant suckling on a nipple, will trigger a sensory neuron to signal a neurosecretory cell to secrete oxytocin, which is a neurohormone. And oxytocin is going to travel to the target cell, in this case the smooth muscle in the mammary glands, to release breast milk. The release of breast milk will cause the infant to keep suckling, reinforcing the stimulus and amplifying the response, which is to keep releasing breast milk. So to go back what I was saying before, while you don't have to memorize everything on the chart, you may be asked to provide an appropriate example of how a hormone can maintain homeostasis by feedback regulation. You may have to compare and contrast negative and positive feedback, or you may have to give an example of how opposing or antagonistic hormones can work together to maintain homeostasis. Look through the rest of this chapter for some examples, although I can tell you that many students like to write about insulin and glucagon as opposing hormones that work together to regulate blood sugar. Remember, go with what you know. I know I didn't cover everything, but that's pretty much the main points for the endocrine system. The rest of the chapter goes through the different hormones and how they work. And now that you're not required to memorize this stuff anymore, it's not in the scope of the class. So while they could ask you questions about the basic functions of the endocrine system, let's say that if they want to ask you a multiple choice question about a specific hormone, they'll probably have to give you the background information in the form of a narrative. But if you happen to be familiar with some of the hormones, it could save you some reading time. And for free responses, it's always wise to have an example in your back pocket just in case. So until next time, be smart and be safe.